Good morning. Oh, that's nice. Thank you. Now, I know I'm in the South, and so Southern preachers tend to go on for a while, but I promise you I've set a timer, so I won't go on for too long. In the North, that joke is more funnier, I guess, but more funny. But I am so excited to be here at Asbury Memorial in the South Georgia Conference. Who would have thought, right? Right? But it's interesting, this isn't the least likely place I've been to. Since that moment last February at the General Conference, which you may have seen online, I've gotten to see so many places where God's spirit of liberating love is moving and creating something new and exciting in our world that's been so plagued, and in our church that's been so plagued with infighting. And so I've gotten to see United Methodists in the strangest places, like rural Wisconsin at a truck stop diner. I've gotten to see United Methodists celebrating their inclusive love in Texas, and now in Georgia. It's been a journey, and this is not the least likely place where God's spirit of justice and liberation is moving. And so since I'm a millennial, and a couple people as I walked in said, well, he looks 12, I promise you I'm a little older than 12, I like to keep people connected and use technology. So if you have a cell phone, I invite you to take it out. Don't worry, it doesn't take your credit card, what I'm about to say. But what I've enjoyed is, and sociologists say that today, I've gotten a lot of sociology this weekend, speaking at Georgia Southern. But sociologists say in our day and age, we define ourselves in terms of networks and not necessarily our immediate physical communities. And so I thought it'd be fun to play with that, especially as social media is taking off and has become a life of its own. So if you have a cell phone, I like to keep all of the churches I visit connected in a network of inclusively minded churches so that we can inspire each other, so that your stories can be shared with those rural churches in Wisconsin, and that the churches in California can know that there are people in the South that are fighting for justice. And so if you have your cell phone, you can text the number 66866. So the number is 66866. It's not 3 6s, don't worry. Some of you are laughing at my terrible jokes, and I really appreciate that. And so you text the number 66866, and the word that you send is forward. F-O-R-W-A-R-D. Forward. F-O-R-W-A-R-D. The number is 66866. And what that does is every 2 weeks I take videos of the people I visit, and I send those around every 2 weeks so that everyone knows they're not alone in this journey. If you haven't figured it out, I'll let your millennial neighbors help you. But now it's time for the meat and potatoes. So and I'm a vegetarian, so meat and potatoes, or vegetables and potatoes, here we go. The moment that changed my life was that General Conference. Now, how many of you know what the General Conference is? Okay, a good half of you. Your pastor's doing a great job then. And for those of you that don't know, you can just think a great disappointment, okay? And so, as I'm there at this giant disappointment, I am from a very small town. It's called Penn Yan. Most people can't even pronounce it. I'm from a very small town in upstate New York. I am 6 hours away from New York City and 2 hours from the Canadian border. So there are more cows than people in my town, and a city is hard to get to. And so I come from this small town in this small area, and it just so happened that these small town folks had voted me to be a delegate to this General Conference, but not a full delegate, a reserve delegate. So I didn't get to go in onto the floor to vote unless someone came out. And I like that wording, someone had to come out. And so, as I'm sitting there, as a reserve delegate, I have to sit high up above in the cheap seats with everybody else because we're at this giant football stadium in St. Louis. I don't know why St. Louis and not somewhere pleasant like Hawaii, but we're here in St. Louis in the middle of February, and I'm in these cheap seats high up above, watching down below this conference unfolding, these people from all over the world coming together in what should be a beautiful expression of what it means to be the body of Christ worldwide. And I'm an optimist, so the first day I was so excited to see all of these people coming together, trying to say hello in as many languages as I could muster, which wasn't many. And as I'm there watching the conference unfold, it became very clear that this body we called church wasn't acting very church-like. We started to talk about people as issues and not people. And we started to demonize each other and act in ways that didn't seem worthy of being called Christian. And so it was only 3 days, and as the conference continued to tear itself apart, and it was clear that our church would not become the inclusive place that we had hoped for. As the conference continued to unravel and emotional chaos ensued, it was at that moment that I got a text message from a conservative man in my delegation. And he said, if the plans about inclusion come up again, you can take my seat. He said, our church is falling apart anyway, and it's not likely that we'll be inclusive, so it won't make a difference whether your voice is up there or down here. So you can have my seat. And I said, well, that doesn't sound very hopeful, but I'll take it. I never played sports, but I feel like that's an experience of a bench warmer, put me in, coach. And so I wasn't too hopeful, but I said, okay, I'll do it. And so this is the second to last day, the penultimate day of the conference, and it's getting towards the evening, and we're losing hope, and it's at that moment that the plans about inclusion did come up. And I got that text message that said, if you run down right now, you can take my seat. And so I turned next to this sweet old lady named Shirley, who was cracking jokes the whole time to keep it light. And I said, Shirley, I'm going in. And she said, give them heaven, honey. And so I ran down past 2 security guards, and my body frame is very intimidating, right? So I made it right past them, sprinted down 2 escalators, and we all had name tags that had barcodes, much like grocery store items. So I stand at this table where they scan me in, J.J. Warren or a pack of bananas, and then they scan the other guy out, they deactivate him, which doesn't sound very pleasant. And so after we've gone through all of this hubbub and this process, I emerge through these doors onto this giant football stadium where thousands of people up above were watching and hundreds of people from around the world were sitting. And I tried to play it cool, walking on while all of these lights and these people were all around. And I sat in my seat, which was in the middle of nowhere, because my conference is from the middle of nowhere. And I sat down, and I pressed my button to speak, having no idea at all what I would say, but knowing that I had to say something. Within 5 minutes of getting that text message, running down, scanning in, sitting down, pressing my button to speak, having no idea at all what I would say, but knowing I had to say something. Now, rewind. Some of you are old enough to remember VHS players. I'm even old enough to remember a VHS player, believe it or not. Rewind 2 months before that, I was back at my home church in that small town. 2 months before the special session, and we were praying for the delegates that were going to General Conference. And afterwards, this sweet older woman, she likes me to call her advanced in years, not old. So this sweet woman who was advanced in years came up to me after the service, and she said, I'm praying for you. I'm praying that God will use your story at that conference to open people's hearts and minds to see people. And in my head, I thought, well, she must be off her rocker. Because there's no way that a reserve delegate college student from a small town could be used by God at that global conference. But out loud, I said, thank you. Fast forward 2 months, and I'm standing there at that microphone having no idea at all what I would say, but knowing I had to say something. And it was in that moment that I shared how I, as a gay United Methodist who feels a calling to ordain ministry, was able on my secular campus — Sarah Lawrence is the second least religious college in the U.S. — was able to bring these people who had experienced churches that had hurt them, was able to bring people who had church pain into a liberating and loving relationship, a relationship which we call Jesus. And I said, isn't that what the church is supposed to do? And what I realized in this moment, which isn't very profound, is that our stories are powerful. That our stories are powerful, that even if we're not in front of a microphone, in front of hundreds of people, we all face those moments where we feel like we don't have the words to say, where we feel like the people we're talking to don't want to listen. And yet it's in those moments that God is able to use us and our stories to open people's hearts and minds. And so my first challenge for you is to think of those people in your church, in your county, in your conference, that you haven't talked to yet. Who do you want to share your story with? Because God can use that to do amazing things. And after that moment, these delegates from a country where it's still illegal to be gay came up to me. And they said, our bishop never shows emotion. But after your speech, he was weeping. He was weeping because he realized that some of the preconceived ideas he had about gay people were wrong. Our bishop from an area outside the U.S. where it's still illegal to be gay realized his narrative, his story was challenged. His heart was opened. Our stories are powerful. Our stories are powerful. And there's a story that I really enjoy from the Prophet Amos that we heard today. And Amos was a small town country boy from a town we probably wouldn't even know existed unless it was in the Bible. And so it's a small town miles away from any city. And it's in this moment in the 8th century. None of you are old enough to remember the 8th century, right? And so it's in this moment in the 8th century, which was an odd time for God to call a prophet. Because in the 8th century, things were going well for the Hebrew community. The people at the top had acquired the most wealth and the most land that they had ever acquired. It seemed like things were going really well on the national level. And as we know, in those times, the religion and the politics were intimately connected. And so the cult of Yahweh, the God that we worship, was connected with these people at the top who were doing really well. And it's at this time in the 8th century when things were going really well for the people at the top that God called this little shepherd boy to go to the northern kingdom and to say to the religious and political leaders of the day, the people who claim to be the worshipers of Yahweh, it's to these people that God spoke through Amos and said, I hate, I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. This is God saying this to the religious institution of the day, the people who claim God's name. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. And the assembly is where the people gathered to be in the presence of the Lord. An assembly in Greek is ekklesia, and ekklesia is the word we use for church. So I won't retroject a later idea of church, but imagine this, that God could be so bold to say to the religious order of the day, you who claim my name, I take no delight in your worship. And it's to these people, the religious people, that Amos continues to say, I will not accept your grain offerings or your burnt offerings, even though you offer me your offerings of fatted animals. Even though you're following everything it says in the book, you're missing the spirit of who I am. Even though you're following the laws that are laid out in the book, and for us, the book of discipline, we're missing the spirit of who God is. Amos continues, even though you've built beautiful houses of hewn stone, even though you have harps and melodies in your worship services, and I might translate this, even though you have beautiful denominations and sanctuaries, even though you have pastors in skinny jeans and great bands with guitar music, even though you have all of these wonderful things, if you're preaching and singing theologies of hate, Yahweh will not claim them. Amen? And we are people, we are witnesses here in the South to a new kind of worship. Not new, but a reclaiming of what was old. We are the people who are reclaiming the spirit of who Yahweh was, is, and will be. We are the people of justice and righteousness. Because the story doesn't end with God saying, I hate, I despise what you're doing. The story continues with an invitation. This chapter ends really weird. After Amos says, I take no delight in your solemn assemblies, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This is a weird transition in poetry. We call it a volta, a turn. It's saying that the story for the religious people didn't end with God saying all that they were doing was wrong, but continued with a challenge and an invitation to the 8th century followers of Yahweh, and an invitation to us today to be the people through which justice and righteousness flow, to be the people who reclaims what it means to be followers of Yahweh, the people of love, the people of justice and mercy and compassion, the true church. Amen.